It's wonderful to be here for the final keynote of today. And what has been a great day of discussion, breaking the network. It's my thanks first of all to Joe for inviting me to chair this session. It is my very great pleasure to introduce this evening two friends and colleagues, Claire Connolly and James Louis Smith, who will this evening be talking on the network, or on network, making and breaking Irish Sea stories. Claire Connolly is Professor of Modern English at UCC. With Marjorie Howes, she was the general editor of a 6-volume series, Irish Literature in Transition, 1700 to 2015, with the Cambridge University Press, published last year in 2020. And she was the editor for volume 2 of that series, Irish Literature in Transition, 1780 to 1830. Her current projects include a new edition of Sheridan Le Fanu's Uncle Silas for the Oxford World's Classics, and a book on Irish Romanticism for Cambridge University Press. As well as all of that, she is the PI for the Ports Past and Present project, funded by the European Regional Development Fund through the Ireland Wales programme. Dr. James Smith is a postdoctoral research fellow in the School of English and Digital Humanities at University College Cork on the Ports Past and Present project. His work is at the intersection of the blue, environmental, spatial and digital humanities. His first monograph, Water in Medieval Intellectual Culture, Case Studies from 12th Century Monasticism, was published in 2018. He's the editor of The Passenger, Medieval Texts and Transits, which was published in 2017, and co-editor of the Open Library of the Humanities collection, New Approaches to Medieval Water Studies. And his current book project, in addition to his work on the Ports Past and Present project, about which I'm sure we're about to hear, his current book project has a working title, Deep Maps of Loch Derg. So I think that is enough from me, and I'm delighted now to hand over to my colleagues on the Ports Past and Present project, Claire and James.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. I'm just going to share my screen, and thank you for the lovely introduction, Jonathan, very nice. And thank you also to Joe for the lovely invitation, and some apologies from me for having missed a lot of the conference today because of something unavoidable that came up as we changed around the dates. So thanks for this slot as well. I know it's late in the day, so James and I will do our very best to keep you entertained. There's a page there showing the title of a work by the Irish author Mariah Edgeworth, an author I've had a long time interest in from her Harry and Lucy stories. They were originally part of Edgeworth's early lessons, which she published first in 1801, and they'd actually emerged initially from manuscript stories that her stepmother had written. So they were basically ways of thinking about how children might be better educated, and they went on to become extremely successful, widely read standalone books based on the Edgeworth family belief in the importance of training up child readers and child thinkers, and that extremely kind of innovative intellectual and cultural experiment went on in the context of pre-famine Ireland, a society shadowed by inequality, shaped by its colonial relationship to Britain. And that's a kind of a tension that I'm going to return to at the end of the talk. So I'm going to talk for a little bit now, introduce us, hand over to James, and I will come back to me for some concluding thoughts before we get to the magic phase where we get to have questions. So I'm going to try and steer the ship now, as it were, in that direction. Elizabeth Eager describes the Edgeworth intellectual project as deriving from Locke, and you can see there's an epigraph from Locke on the front of this particular volume, and especially the kind of heuristic idea of adult-child dialogue. So in the stories, Harry and Lucy, the children, they grow up with the stories, they get older, are often discussing things with themselves, between themselves and with their parents and with some other kind of well-informed adults. And there's also the kind of foundational belief in the value of the association of ideas as well. So the particular excerpt from Harry and Lucy that I want to introduce you to now bears on the idea of network and the term network especially. And I want to kind of, as I say, moves along with this discussion. So in this particular part of the Harry and Lucy stories, Harry and Lucy find themselves extremely unfortunately with bad weather, unable to visit a site that they had hoped to visit that day. They're often visiting ironworks or steelworks or mines or, new bridge projects, ports, places where they can learn about the latest technological developments. But because of bad weather, they can't do that. And also they haven't been able to visit somebody whom they'd hoped to visit and from whom they'd hoped to borrow some books. So they can't go out and they don't have any books to read. So it's a very sticky situation. There's no, they don't have an iPad either or access to anything like that. So what Harry and Lucy do is they begin a little project. They take down Johnson's dictionary. They find there is a little octavo volume of Johnson's dictionary where they're staying, not the kind of the luxury volume with lots of quotations from learned authors, but just this little slim volume that gives just the meaning and derivations of words. And they play a game of asking each other to come up with meanings, definitions, proper definitions for the words, which then test against Johnson. So they start with to darn, and Harry asks Lucy to define darn, which he rather annoyingly describes as a woman's word. And Lucy kind of gets her back up a bit about this. She also doesn't do very well at defining it, and she's often describing the activity of darning rather than coming up with a definition of an acceptable definition of what it means to darn, and falls far short of Dr. Johnson's wonderfully crisp definition of to darn as to mend holes by imitating the texture of the stuff. Lucy, though, you'll be delighted to hear, gets her revenge when it comes to network. Which is thus described by Johnson. And some of the discussion is here. It's just for interest, really, so you don't have to be looking at me all the time, which is just thus described by the learned doctor. This is the definition: anything reticulated or decussated at equal distances with interstices between the intersections. Now, you'll agree that the definition of to darn is a little bit crisper than the one of network. So the children puzzle, as you're probably puzzling right now, about reticulation, decussation, interstices and intersections. And so they look up decussate, as you might well do, which it means to intersect at acute angles. So they're thinking about it, and Harry says, well, that's something like netting, isn't it? Intersecting at angles. And then they look up intersect and they think about that as well. And they have a debate about whether to intersect means to cut or to join. The scene ends with Harry essentially admitting Lucy's triumph over Dr. Johnson, admitting the kind of inadequacy of the definition. Harry says, but you've triumphed over him when you caught him in your network, says Harry. So kind of cleverly turns the phrase in another way. And I've tried to borrow some of the kind of energy of that final definition, network, for our talk. Johnson's definition is bad because the children conclude, or the children learn, because it's unclear and it's overwritten, and because it obscures something that should be very plain. And in fact, Edgeworth was not alone. Many 19th century commentators use this particular definition, the one of network, as an example of a problem in Johnson's dictionary and a challenge to the project of dictionary making more generally. But some recent critics have actually found something good to say about this notoriously bad definition of network. Praised now as a definition that does actually seek out the ontological identity of what a network actually is. A definition that has technical integrity, Henry Hitchens says, rather than working by analogy. And in Grant Balmer Johnson's book, In Human Networks, about social media and the archaeology of connection, he says that Dr. Johnson's definition of network has the merit of showing how network refers to both physical objects and a kind of dematerialized form or metaphysical kind of connectivity. Grant Balmer is especially interested in the way in which Johnson's definition holds on to the older 18th century idea of network as pertaining to things like, he gives the example of ropes that covered hot air balloons, or the rigging, the interconnected rigging on ships. Okay, so I'm going to sort of follow through this idea now, and I'm particularly wanting to hold on to that idea of a distinction between the meanings of network as dematerialized forms of interconnectivity, and also pertaining to physical kinds of connectivity, spanning physical objects and this kind of more dematerialized world. The stories in Harry and Lucy are set amidst family networks. So Maria Edgeworth's father, Richard Lovell Edgeworth, was a member of the Lunar Society, part of the Midlands Enlightenment, the English Midlands Enlightenment Circle that included Wedgwood and Erasmus Darwin and so on. And a bit like Charles Darwin, Edgeworth was a kind of offspring of that Midlands Enlightenment, the Lunar Enlightenment, and those family connections shape the Harry and Lucy stories. There's also a way in which the stories bear more immediately on physical aspects of travel, especially to do with steam. So the network discussion happens in a version of Harry and Lucy from 1825, which of course is very shortly after steam had started to be used on the Irish Sea, first in 1821. And the children in these stories are often talking about steam travel, steam technology, just exactly how steam works. There are discussions about which country can take credence or can take credit for the invention of steam technology. The role of the crossing from Dublin to Holyhead is discussed, and so on. So it's only a short few years after. This is a drawing from 1819 by Sarah Grace Carr, who has a lovely visual tour of Wales, which is also supplemented on the Irish side. Could still imagine Holyhead as this kind of pastoral scene of, you know, small boats and pleasure boats and so on, to be totally transformed in kind of cultural representation once the steam ships first started to ply the Irish Sea. This is a kind of triumphalist painting by William John Huggins of George IV on board the Lightning, the first post office steam packet to go from Holyhead to Dublin. You might remember the story that George IV was making his royal visit to Dublin, and the royal yacht couldn't cross the Irish Sea because of bad weather. But to go back to our children, Harry and Lucy, the fact that they are children aligns them in some way with some of these kind of things that we might gather under the heading of weather, sort of unpredictability, contingency, things that can't be planned. I mean, they're very exemplary children in lots of ways, but they are still children, and Edgeworth uses that to allow them to ask to be curious and imaginative. It's also bad weather that drives them indoors. That's why they're sitting around talking about Johnson's dictionary. So in what follows, James and I are going to kind of test out some more thinking about networks in the particular case of Irish Sea crossing, and we're going to do it by focusing on a particular travel narrative as well, a particular tour. I'll come to that shortly. But just before we come to the particular case, I just want to give you a few more kind of, I suppose, headings or things that are shaping our inquiries as we try and test out the kind of prompts Joe gave us for the conference around networks, making and breaking networks in relation to the particular case of the cultural history of Irish Sea crossings. So thinking about interconnectedness and breaking apart, of course, these are concepts that are already inherent to any discussion of 19th century Ireland and Britain at the macro level of high politics, but of course also across many related domains, whether cultural or intimate and so on. So what does the Irish Sea crossing offer to help us think about the issues identified for the conference? Distance, diversity, dispersal are already strongly present within any kind of history of Irish sea crossings. There is a worry, and I've sort of parked the worry a little bit, but you might want to have me talk more about it or have ideas yourself about it in the questions, about the extent to which a term like network might sort of undo a very important history of power relations, or kind of neutralize some of the power relations that are equally inherent to our understanding of British-Irish relations in the 19th century, you know, take away some of our ability to talk about power at the level of the state, the kind of stuff we really get when we have that word infrastructure at play. So it's important for us in the talk, I think, to keep infrastructure at play, just as Nitin did this morning, as we think about what it means to track interconnectivities across water and what it means to visualize such interconnectivities, both in terms of physical objects or in more dematerialized ways, the tangible and the intangible aspects of network. So our case then is particularly is shaped, I suppose, by these relationships of power, drawing on the theory and history of infrastructure as kind of material, maybe symbolic sometimes, assemblages that kind of embed power in particular place. And thinking about roads especially, but maybe also bridges, ports, docks, the kind of the coastal infrastructure as well, more generally, as active, sometimes even malevolent. I recently read David Farrier's book about future fossils, and I was very taken by his discussion about the hungry road. He draws it from Ben Ockery and the kind of idea of infrastructure that consumes cultures and needs to be sort of respected. And there's death and loss, disaster, shipwrecks obviously are always powerfully present. So a few other kind of concepts that are important then as we go into this particular case study that I want to look at. Just one sec. So I mentioned that we're going to talk about a particular tour, which is the one we're going to talk about is a tour of North Wales and Ireland. But James and I are working with and alongside a project that was created, a digital project that was created by colleagues of ours in the University of Wales, Trinity St. David at the Centre for Advanced Welsh and Celtic Studies, in collaboration with Glasgow, funded by the HRC, and that's Curious Travellers. And the Curious Travellers text is Scottish and Welsh text. So we're looking just at the Welsh text and those Welsh texts with an Irish aspect. And often that's because of the history of travel between Britain and Ireland. The Welsh texts often do have this Irish dimension, part of the whole East-West colonial story that we're tracing. And across the Curious Travellers texts, we find a few different kind of concepts that are important and part of the history, but also part of the story we want to tell. So one is obviously the role of topography as well as infrastructure. So the bad roads, the slippery boulder stones, the sweeping sands, the deep precipices that shape and direct travel between Britain and Ireland, as well as travellers' growing wonder at technical improvements along the route. We're also interested in weather and in terms of tracking these interconnectivities across water, especially what weather makes of travel, of perspectives, coastal weather especially, and the work that it does. And in some of these tours, there's amazing weather descriptions when, you know, black clouds envelop mountains. There's one tour by Frances Crew who talks about the strange mix of sea and sky on the Welsh coast. And she says someplace, I think I don't even know what to make of these topsy-turvy countries. She says countries like Wales and Ireland where you can't tell the sea from the sky or blue from grey and so on. is cultural difference and language. Mariah Edgeworth, for example, when she travels through North Wales, talks about going on the high road through Bangor to Holyhead, the road, and she says all she hears are people saying dim Saesneg, no English. And she just renders that in a kind of phonetic way. Other travelers remark that you can have as much 12 hours difference between the clocks on a single stage on the Holyhead Road. Comparison then as well, that's kind of implicit there already, the cultural work of comparison, how much it drives and shapes knowledge across roads and bridges and bodies of water. So Marianne Eade's tour, the one we're going to look at in more detail in a few minutes, says, when she goes to Ireland, she says, well, we are now in our United Kingdom. She's writing in 1802 after the Act of Union, but she sort of looks around and finds everything a little bit shabby by comparison to a sort of an unnamed comparison. So she goes to the Long Room Hub in Trinity College Dublin, which she describes as dusty. There's poverty every place. The objects in the Trinity Museum are common. She says Stephen's Green is nothing except a large field with a kind of a walk all around it. Marion Square is another kind of field. So this cultural work of comparison, as I say, is kind of driving knowledge along infrastructure. And finally, environment, so noting aspects of natural history and so on along the tours as well. So I mentioned that we're going to look at this particular tour, which is a journal of a tour from Clapton through North Wales to Ireland. It's here on the Curious Traveller site, edited by our colleague on the Ports Project, Elizabeth Edwards. And there's an introduction also on the site by Elizabeth Edwards, where she just tells us that Marianne Eade came from a London merchant family background, recounts a journey made in the spring of 1802 in the company of her husband William, beginning in London, going in through the Midlands, North Wales, Dublin and County Wicklow before returning to North London. You might get the context of the date there, 1802. So even though it more or less coincides with the Peace of Amiens, this is the period of the home tour in the context of the Napoleonic and Peninsular Wars. So Marianne Eade's tour gives us at once a kind of an intimate history of the Irish Sea crossing, but it also gives us an example of what is effectively a kind of a lone fragile object, which was lying in the National Library of Wales until Liz picked it up, transcribed it, prepared it for this website and so on. And with that aspect of the story, as we move from kind of physical object into the less material kind of interconnectivity we now have with this tour, James is going to pick up the story.
So essentially, like picking up where Claire left off, I mean, basically the Curious Travellers Project and editors such as Liz Edwards took material that was lesser known or undigitized, annotated it with TEI, the Text Encoding Initiative, in XML in markup language, so that it could then capture the various valences of things like people, places. They also created an index of artworks that are talked about, for example, in the corpus as a whole. So they went for a big number of tours and narratives, but a relatively limited and controlled vocabulary of people and places and things that cut across, and then created very thorough little biographies, abstracts for, say, people as they came into the stories, who are shared, basically linked data. So if it's Marianne Eade in this story, it's the same, that it's the same individual in all of the texts that are in the corpus, which is easily done with unique identifiers that you mark up. Like you can sort of see this is what you're looking at on the screen is Recogito, which is a project, an online sort of content management system for this kind of work that calls itself annotation without the pointy brackets. So basically what it lets you do is jump right in and start getting a text and saying, is this word representing a place, a person, or, an event, for example. You can then use the gazetteers that it has associated with it. A gazetteer is what you might have seen in analog forms, the list of places, but a digital list of places. There's many of them, and they're often very subject specific, drawing all of those resources together to essentially refine and annotate text. What we've started doing is annotating something that's already been annotated. So we're coming in on top of a mature project, Curious Travelers, that had a very limited remit by virtue of wanting to be extremely good at capturing a certain level of detail on a limited number of types of entities, such as people and places. And then we've come in, and our colleague Daniela, who's been marking this text up, with our sort of collaboration, has started to bring in that existing work, reconcile it together, put it into the text, but then start adding on top of it. So basically, this is the power of digital humanities working on top of digital humanities, and also the power of a system such as Recogito, taking a lot of the subject-specific knowledge out of markup, not having to use a separate XML annotation software and a separate set of tools and methods to mark it up, but in fact, collaboratively, multiple people can work on one of these texts and put them together. The results, the sort of preliminary results of that so far, we've just been working on this Eid, this tour, because it's an excellent, and it has so many, like the granularity of words about travel and about mobility, interruption of mobility, weather, use of infrastructure, roads, stopping places, and also just there was just so much to start with that we thought it would be a good pilot. But ultimately, what the goal is now is to get a series of sort of fellow traveler texts that are the Irish Sea crossing, and rather than going broad and limiting a range of how to describe them, going very deep. So basically creating a very subject-specific infrastructural network and its discontents, a limited set of tools, but then a wide variety of entities. So I'll just show you kind of what we've started with. So basically, this is kind of what the text looks. So you can still basically read it like you normally would. This is just the same text that was created for Curious Travelers, but it has, for example, a biography for William Eade that comes straight out of the Curious Travelers biography, but also Clapton has been, that you can create like a location for certain places like Swansea, and it shows you that a gazetteer, Geonames, has one for Swansea, and you go through the whole thing and you do it. And but you can also annotate time, relate. So that 9:15 pertains to the 14th of May and Friday in the morning. So you can link a bunch of time-related descriptors together. And you can also say like an abstraction like our darling boy. We know that that's actually the same William that is William. Sorry, that's a different William. But you see, otherwise it gets very confusing because often it's referred to as the boy or, our boy, or not referred to directly. But by doing this, it makes it very easy to disambiguate it in a much more, and the same of place names. But now, that's the top layer. But now what we're starting to do is, drill down and think about the depth of networked travel. So we started with a few things that Daniela noticed as jumping out. This is the tour, all the locations, all the locations mapped out of the tour, starting in London, moving up Holyhead, crossing into Dublin and returning. This is all of them regardless of what kind of annotation they are. But then what you can start doing is creating different types of annotation and tagging them. So, for example, these are all places and people, all of these are just unique identifiers. But we've also started, doing timestamps, dynamic and static weather. So different kinds of weather. So descriptors of changeable weather versus a sort of something like a storm, something that's like an event, versus a sort of descriptor of change versus an adjective of something being, fierce or placid or that kind of thing. We're starting to get into the specificities of weather, but that we kind of got inspiration from a very well-known Lake Districts project that was done at the University of Lancaster that used GIS to look at romantic poetry around the Lake District and look at its kind of its use of terms like sublime, for example, and to sort of break down those kind of more nebulous and see who was interested in it being in sublime landscape and who was interested in what descriptors. That's what we're starting to do now with other descriptors. We've got that far with time and weather, but what we're going to keep doing is going deeper and thinking about places that the tour stopped, reasons it might have stopped, or being forced to stop due to bad weather, due to roads, etc. Places where it started off, but trying to just keep drilling down into things like why does a journey stop? Why does it start? What causes it to go this way rather than that way? And that's a social network thing as well, because of course patrons and supporters and family friends, etc. Inducing the party to come and stay at their estate, that kind of thing draws and moves a sort of, especially a leisure traveler, sort of tourist, as it were, in the original sense, around, back and forth. How much of that can we capture if we just use a sort of fairly limited range of text, but just keep going down, down, down? And in a way, what this is it's digital humanities as humanities, because this is the point at which Claire's inquiry sort of steps off and we start using data and annotation and markup and spatial humanities methodologies to just continue that. So this is just our start, but basically what we're now going to do is start picking apart that net that we were talking about, thinking about what other sort of units of authority or power or political ecology might be at play beyond, more monolithic terms, technological infrastructures, political polities, models of governance, empire, that kind of thing. What else can also be used, which is sort of close reading essentially, but we're just kind of going off in a close reading direction, but using spatial humanities. And then what we then want to do is break down this network by annotation. So this is just the first step, because then we can start to analyze this material and export it from Recogito. I mean, just to give you an example of some of the things, so if it's all in here, you can look at the sort of the places, but you can also see other types of descriptors where it talks about, the circumstances under which Birmingham is discussed, and it lets you pass through. But you can also, display it in different ways, use social network analysis. There's all kinds of, once you've created this data, or these data, as it were, you can use them for a variety of visualization, tasks and different arguments. And I know that all of us, Daniela, myself, and Claire, have different ideas about what that could be. But this is just the groundwork in order to do that. And looking at the redundancies and tangles in networks, I guess I always think of ARPANET, the first internet, the military American internet, that was extraordinarily redundant because it had all these missing nodes in it. Where are the missing nodes? Where are the sort of the weaknesses, and where are the repairs in networks? Where are the asymmetries? Where are the unexpected actors in the network? And that's what we're trying to use this for. So that's just my little précis, but I'll go back to Claire now. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Claire will wrap up our discussion.
Thanks, James. So James and I both want to say thanks to Daniela Trainer, who gave us some research assistance on the working with Recogito. Daniela just graduated from UCC with a BA in Digital Humanities and Information Technology, and has been a great source of support doing that work. And like James said, that's what the three of us have been talking about, are sort of codified hubs and spokes of travel and power. And they obviously come, as I was saying, just as I introduced James, they come from a particularly kind of fraught historical context right here with the Mary Ann Eade tour, because it's 1802, the Napoleonic wars are still raging on the continent. People are traveling in doing the home tour, traveling in Britain and Ireland in ways that were not previously known. The aftermath of the 1798 rebellion is also present in Marianne Eade's tour. When she goes to Wicklow, she talks about the sites she's seeing as sites with a very recent political history, which she knows about and talks about as well. But that context changed, of course, as the 19th century went on. And just for what time we've left, I just want to talk about a few of those changes and some things about what we could do more. This is just another little example of some of the same kind of work done by our colleague Elizabeth Edwards, who is involved in Curious Travellers. This is on our own website, the Ports Past and Present project. She has a lovely story on women and the Ireland-Wales crossing, and Marianne Eade is part of that story, as is Mary Wollstonecraft, if you can look there and see the picture. So that circumstance changed, and in particular the kind of the inevitability of the Welsh leg of the Irish tour, or the North Wales, the linkage of visiting North Wales and Wicklow, both, for example, in the same tour, which seemed so they were so tightly knit as a kind of an experience in the early 19th century. They changed throughout the century, partly because of changes in infrastructure, travel times, technology, the experience of famine in Ireland as well. But we do find this interesting very late 19th century example of a North Wales tour made by two Irish women. And those were the writers Somerville and Ross. And Somerville and Ross shared with Maria Edgeworth, with whom I began, a kind of an Anglo-Irish background, Somerville especially associated with the family landed estates, and both women enjoyed the Anglo-Irish pursuit of horseback riding. So they write this kind of witty North Wales tour called Beggars on Horseback, where they imagine themselves as beggars traveling around North Wales. And in the context of this story, one of the things they do is they kind of remake the crossing across the Irish Sea, this form of watery interconnectivity that James and I have been thinking about how best to theorize and to trace, as a kind of pastoral chronotope. It becomes a sort of a smooth sequential experience across time and space. And it does so particularly when they arrive on the Holyhead Road. They're in North Wales now. They've taken out the horses. They're going for some hack work, as they describe it, along the roads of North Wales. And when they get to the Holyhead Road, they imagine it as this kind of pastoral experience, the kind of it's shaded in the golden glow of memory. You know, many an Irish parliamentarians thrilled here with the inward rehearsal of the peroration that should shake Westminster. Many a grudging rebel eye look for the first time at the roadside life of a country whose beauty would put Ireland on her mettle to excel. This is North Wales, and so on. So patriots, undergraduates, geniuses, duelists, the best that Ireland had to give, swung along this road towards London to the tune of 16 hoofs. The glamour of coach travel on the road. And the way in which they cast this sort of golden glow of memory over the Holyhead Road seems of a piece with a sort of a late 19th century reimagination of infrastructure, some of which I know we're going to hear more about from Ruth and from Nicola as well. This passage makes me think of nothing so much as the passage in Jude the Obscure, where Jude and Sue meet on the old road from London to Land's End. It's described as a main road running due east and west, and you might remember he gives her a crook and she poses as a shepherdess on the road. And it seems to be a similar kind of, kind of remaking of infrastructure according to a kind of a vision, a fragile, unstable vision of a sort of mock pastoral network or something. So I'm going to end where I began, and that is with Harry and Lucy, and with Edgeworth, and the children who taught us that networks involve cutting and joining, or meeting and crossing. Their discussion of netting and meshwork as well, and that's an important term, resonate, I think, in significant ways with some contemporary debates about network theory. And thinking especially, and I suppose these are my final points, about how the discussion emerges from a piece of imaginative writing by Maria Edgeworth, an author who knew Irish sea crossings well from her own family history, because she is Anglo-Irish. It's kind of hardwired into the Anglo-Irish experience, the making Ireland English that required countless sea crossings. It emerges from Harry and Lucy, a text first written as the steam crossings started to change Irish sea travel and to reshape coastal infrastructure. And also from a writer, Edgeworth, whose ideas about childhood encompass a whole set of ideas about, or theories about kind of training and skills, or you could say now, I suppose, maybe about how critical and technical maturity need to emerge side by side. And there's a startling contemporaneity to some of her ideas about, you could say, you know, STEM lessons for children or something like that, that sits strangely alongside the context of an educational philosophy born amidst the deep clefts of colonialism. And part of that unpredictability belongs to the kind of later history of Harry and Lucy. This is a kind of a fair copy of Harry and Lucy, including, if you look, a fair copy of the actual title page done by a child just a little later in the 1820s, and the child was John Ruskin, who was very interested in the Harry and Lucy stories, and who kind of dutifully transcribed pages and pages of the of Harry and Lucy, including these absolutely gorgeous drawings. This is Harry and Lucy's house, and this is Lucy's rabbit hutch. Done by Ruskin. Now Ruskin, the enemy of steam and progress and industrialization, but also pointing us to the kind of role of the importance of certain kinds of making and the training up in kinds of making that Ruskin appreciated in Edgeworth, and that Edgeworth points us towards an understanding of network in its physical meaning, always in relation to the kind of dematerialized forms of interconnectivity then. So it's the critical Lucy then, I think, who catches Dr. Johnson in her network and her meshwork of reading, who's a kind of a model to us all, the energy of the child's questions, their resonant ability to kind of to capture concepts that can often seem to elude us because of their very kind of omnipresence in our lives, and the overriding context of the work that has to be done or ends up being done because the weather isn't great. So thank you. I think we'll finish at that.
Thank you very much, Claire and James. I'm going to abuse my my privilege first of all before I come to Caroline's question, and I'm afraid my question is sort of rather loose, and I'll try not to make it too rambling, but it's a sort of loose set of reflections, I think. But I was struck that Maria Ann Eade's journey from Clapton to Dublin mirrors exactly mine. Albeit that I ended in Cork and didn't go back, but and the Clapton, Holyhead and Dublin that I travelled through are both the same and very different to those that are described in this account of Mary Ann Eade's tour. So I suppose broadly I've got one sort of question for Claire sort of on the back of that, and one really for James. And Claire, I suppose my question is, what resonances do you think do these patterns of travel and connection and network, which as you've identified is about disconnection as well as connection between Wales and Ireland, or these islands more widely, are kind of, what resonances for contemporary connections do you kind of see in these 19th century accounts of those connections? And James, I wondered how this form of mapping kind of mirrors or sits alongside the kind of wider process of mapping that the Ports Past and Present project is engaged in, which is about mapping experiences that kind of, you know, transcend the 19th century in both directions, really. What kinds of similarities and differences in terms of those patterns do you see emerging, if any? So I'll ask that first, and then Caroline, I'll come to you for a question afterwards, if that's okay.
Empty to talk about Brexit, Jonathan, isn't it?
I mean, I didn't like to...
Mariah Edgeworth says at some point in her correspondence that the heart is sick with hoping for books to arrive from England to County Longford. And speaking as somebody who was asked to pay €112 of a customs charge on a parcel of books last week, I'm beginning to sympathise. But actually, I think so a couple of things. It was your journey and it's her journey, and that's exactly it. It's so deeply grooved, these roots, aren't they? And yet there's your journey and her journey are so highly particular and bounded by culture and experience and class and gender and everything, you know, and time bound in very specific ways. And we have to try and capture both. And I think that's why we need both kind of network theory and infrastructure theory, actually, side by side. And if James's part of the talk in a way was kind of showing us that what happens when humanities knowledge migrates into the digital environment and finds its way around digital networks, and I see that as a kind of an analog, I suppose, for the problem of, or the case of, what happens when the kind of the single manuscript, the tour that's in the National Library makes its way onto the web, or the single life story, maybe, which is yours, intersects with this much broader kind of cultural and historical pattern. I
suppose my point would be about the power of interoperability. So I mean, basically, when you're creating this annotation in Recogito, you're creating linked open data. And the idea of that is that Marianne Eade is Marianne Eade, no matter whether she's in her own text, right, you know, what going on a journey, or whether it's in another text that's like written last year referring to her, that if we've decided whatever is and to annotate that. So the power of marking up texts and really making certain decisions about what classes of, you know, entities within a text should be annotated and linked with each other. Actually, then it's about what combination is meaningful to your research. So this is preparation, this is scholarly editing, but it is also, I mean, in our case, the point is mostly about the early 19th century, you know, or, you know, there's a particular milieu to it of, you know, comparing like to some extent, but you could just as easily do a like transtemporal slice, if, you know, whatever you wanted. But that's the power of preparing texts and putting all that work into preparing them. So that would be my point, is once you've combined, and I guess if you're talking about comparing it to Ports Past and Present, I suppose this is, in this case, this is depth within a text. You know, that's deep mapping in a way. You can get a text and really go deep into granularity of what is worth annotating and what is worth capturing. Whereas deep mapping can also be a wide variety of different types of text in a confined place, or in a, you know, in a distinct, which is what we're doing for the Irish Sea region in Ports Past and Present. But you can combine the two together. You can go deep in a text and then combine that with a depth of other kind of material, especially if the text is very deeply rooted in place. Like, I think depth can mean a lot of things when it comes to like breadth of description. It just depends on what kind of breadth of types of material you want to map deeply.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, both. Caroline, straight over to you for your question.
Hi, thank you. I thought that was great. Really, really loved that paper. And I think you've already started to open up, I think, some of the directions I was going to head in here. I mean, I love the way there's a really interesting combination of methodologies here. I mean, you've got the intimate networks of reading. So Edgeworth reading Johnson, Ruskin reading Edgeworth, which is a localized reader network study. You've got mention of close reading. You know, at one point you said, oh, this is actually some close reading. You've also got the quantitative methodologies which I don't know if you would use the Moretti term distant reading or not, or whether you'd find that problematic, but that idea of taking larger scale text. But then you've also got the individual text that you're doing the formalist analysis of when you're talking about that deep mapping of textual terms. And I guess as somebody who's wrestled for a long time with history of reading and its relationship to broader power structures, I find that what you're doing really, really kind of exciting, but also kind of challenging in a way as to how you link all these things together. Or is it the case, as you're suggesting, that actually you're setting different researchers off in different directions to do whatever they want with this project? And if so, you know, the interesting thing would be what you've set up for them. I mean, do your key terms allow them to navigate in new ways, or do you feel sometimes you're having debates over what you're actually, you know, marking up on text? Do you think that's setting up a particular path that you're sending readers down, or are you opening up something a lot wider? So it's really a broader question about methodologically what kind of debates you have about this project, about what you want it to do, and whether there's any tensions between those really interesting but quite different methodologies that you're kind of working as a team with.
That's really interesting. We're definitely not, as it were, setting people off to do jobs, but the reason we're working on one particular tour is because we want to try and develop something meaningful that can be scaled up, and we would definitely, and we chose to work with the Curious Travelers corpus, partly because we have good research relationships. The PIs on that project are Marianne Constantine and Nigel Leask, partly because we have good relationships, but also because of what James said about interoperability and believing in the importance of kind of networking between digital projects like this one, and not just kind of letting one sit there or whatever. And one thing I've definitely learned from this that I think is important is the power of being able to use off-the-shelf tools like Recogito to be able to get quite granular with those. So I don't know if that granularity is the same as close reading, but it's something like it, I think. And again, something I've learned from doing it and talking to James is how much there's a lot of kind of itinerary work in spatial humanities, isn't there, James, and digital humanities, but a lot of it is about kind of sequence mapping at a pretty big scale, and you need resources and you need kit and everything to do all of that. But something like Recogito, we're just able to take one story, which we already had the TEI version of, and start playing around with it. So somehow I feel that's whatever the answer is to making those connections. And I love the way you describe them between the intimate networks of reading, to kind of place them on a bigger and bigger map, if you like, which it becomes in the end a map of those power relationships. I think we need, it's the power of the off-the-shelf tool to help you do that. You know,
I agree, and I think it ultimately, I mean, like with all digital projects, and in fact all scholarly projects, it's about resources. I mean, all projects, when they set out to do digital scholarly editing, have to decide what's important to them and what to mark up. But I guess the power of being able to work with existing corpora that have already been very, very rigorously digitized and annotated, and existing tools, is you can jump, you know, like piggyback, and then you can say, well, actually, rather than that committing resources to that stage of it, I can commit another kind of resources, which is trying to have, as you said, those conversations about types of annotation and trying to, but then I guess the power of something like Recogito is it's very easy to get into it. And I think that's one thing, if I could say, is that it's almost like what is the relationship between any individual scholar and the primary source or a text. Everyone has their own gloss and their own reading and does their own work with it. You could actually see something like TEI, if we're in this stage where it's new, it's so much more accessible than it used to be, maybe we're approaching to some extent a world where there can be that relationship where any scholar, if there is a good quality TEI text of something, any scholar can have that relationship one-on-one or as a group with the text.
Thank you, it's great.
Thanks for your question and for those answers. We've got time, I think, just for one last question, because I know we're on a tight schedule, and I don't want to bleed too much into the kind of hangout time afterwards. So I've got two very short questions. I'll have to keep them quite short and sweet, and then I know that Joe wants to come in at the end just to say a couple of words. So Nicola, will go to you first, and then Nitin, if you could keep your questions short and sweet, then I'd be grateful.
Thank you so much, and thank you for sharing Harry and Lucy with us, and Ricogito as a tool that you've been using. I had a question about sort of frequency and reiteration, because it seems that in both your methods of looking at this corpus and in your thoughts about sort of sea crossings and roads and so on, in both of these, there has to be repetition. There has to be repetition by different people. So if you're using a kind of either open access tool or an existing piece of software, then you're working through that sort of framework. I just wondered if you sort of had any thoughts about the way those two things sort of resonate with each other, so methodology and the object of your study.
Thanks, Nicola. And Nitin, if you'd like to ask your question.
Great. Thanks for this fascinating paper, Claire and James. I have a very quick, I'm thinking historically 1820s, 1830s, I mean, historically thinking about that period. What appears to me, what I gathered, maybe I haven't completely got the paper, the content of it, but what appears to me is text, technology, and landscape. These three main constituents are constituting a certain kind of power. But then I'm asking myself, what is the social location of this power? Where is people in this story? And if we are thinking of the mechanisms of power or its nature, then I feel we are bound to then also try to discover the opposite of power, which is resistance or social conflict and contestation. So where is, how are we historically thinking of constitution of power through the process of conflict?
James, do you want to answer Nicola, and I'll try Nitin? Will that work in the interest of time?
So we were talking about, can I ask for the reiteration of the question for Nicola? Sorry, just as a reminder.
You're welcome to unmute just to, my understanding of the question was...
I was just waiting to be unmuted there, sorry.
Thanks.
So I guess what prompted the question was the link between network as something made anew and then darning as going over something that already exists and kind of strengthening it. And yeah, that
it's a really good question. It takes us to the kind of materiality, doesn't it, issue. And when I saw it in the chat there, the thing it made me think of was Ruskin remaking Edgeworth, because that's a kind of imitation, isn't it? It's an inferior imitation of the printed source, but it has its own sort of creativity. And one thing we know about the kind of print culture that Edgeworth was a part of was how kind of animated it was by questions of copying and imitation and so on. I think you'll just have to leave it with us. It's definitely got us thinking. Yeah,
I do have something to add to that though, but I think, I mean, in an ideal world where this is a kind of open data thing, that if TEI projects, mark up and digitize and annotate, TEI documents and then share them after or during the life cycle of their project, I mean, I think we could be in a world where there's a lot more of that kind of adorning and, patching and renewing of critical editions of text. I mean, there's a lot of talk about living books and crowdsourced critical editions. I mean, it's a really active and exciting area about a living document. But I think that the more generous donations of this kind of material, the more of that is accessible, the more chance there will be for this kind of just trying to be consistent, but just going deeper and adding more and more classes of descriptors and being able to filter them and cut them out and remove whatever's not relevant to your argument. But just that kind of, yeah, real care to like detail, which I suppose you could say is like the conversation around the text, where different resonances, different words, different interpretations are constantly through, you know, scholarly dialogue augmented. I'd love to see, and I think it's happening, I'd love to see more of that in a sort of marked up form as well. And I think it's starting to happen, and I hope it will more.
And just to go to Nitin's question, which was a great provocation, I think part of the answer is to do with the kinds of, not the answer, but the provocation is to kind of go back and rethink and think more about what we're doing with the tour. Because when Marianne Eade goes to Wicklow, she travels on new military roads that have been laid down to help the army put down the 1798 rebellion and to secure Ireland in the aftermath of the Union, and the whole kind of coastal infrastructure, the Martello Towers, the Napoleonic signal towers on the southwest coast. These are all the signs of that power, but there are traces of the resistance too in the Eade tour. But you're sort of looking for it. So I suppose the Edgeworth example I gave, when she's going through Bangor and she reports that people just say to her, "Dim Saesneg, no English," that encodes a kind of resistance to the travelers approach. You know, it's a kind of stumbling block on the route. And yeah, James is just saying in the chat that we need to think about these new, you know, to nuance our understanding of the political ecologies as well. You know, Edgeworth in the 1820s was working on the Harry and Lucy stories, but she wasn't writing novels about Ireland in the 1820s. The Rockite Rebellion was in full sway. So there's an extent to which we need to bring that background in more, I think, but that there's a kind of turning away from a set of circumstances in order to think about children and education as well as everything else. So yeah, getting a bit incoherent now, but thank you.
I hate to cut us off in our prime, but I have to. We've overrun already, which I had one job and I failed, so apologies, Joe. Just want to conclude by saying, again, thank you for having me, Joe, and thank you to both of our speakers and to all of those who have posed questions, and hopefully there'll be an opportunity to continue these conversations afterwards. So thank you, and